In this video, I'm going to use a model and a picture to describe the difference between a sports hernia and hip impingement. Hey everyone, I'm Sebastian at Performance Play Sports Care, part of the locally world famous chiropractors in Costa Mesa, California. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what these two things are, and actually there's a much more confusion about what a sports hernia is versus what an inguinal or abdominal hernia is. We've done videos on that topic as well. You can find them in the links below or onto our channel, and you can use the search bar to find them. Now, hip impingement and a sports hernia are very different from each other, but the problem is many people will feel the problem into this area and not know which it is, or be very confused about which diagnosis is ailing them. Now, hip impingement, I'm going to use this model first just to show you what's going on in the hip, and impingement is exactly what it sounds like. There's something pinching in the hip, and this is a hip model, and this is the hip bone. Here is the hip flexor. Here is the front of the hip, and here's the back of the hip where some of the gluteal muscles are and some of the deep rotators of the hip. Now, the hip, the area itself, the joint is actually under here. There's the hip flexor that goes over the top of it. And oftentimes people, when they feel pain in the front of the hip, they'll be pushing on the area of the hip flexor and say, well, I think it's my hip flexor too, which we do have another video on that as well. But hip impingement itself has nothing to do with the hip flexor being pinched on. It has more to do with what's going on underneath this ligamentous structure right into here. And when the hip goes into full flexion, as you start to get into a bent hip position like I'm in right now, the pelvis and the femur come in contact with each other and create symptoms of pinching in the front of the hip. Now, what's pinching in there most of the time is something called a cam deformity or a pincer deformity, and those are types of hip impingements. Overall, we have other videos on those topics as well, but what you have to understand to figure out the difference between the two of sports hernia and hip impingement is, first off, just understand that hip impingement typically is tested with passive motion. It's tested to see if generally putting the hip into a flexed position in a little bit of hip rotation creates the problem. I'll give you an example right now. So a nice hip impingement test that we do, or a lot of people do on their own, is one that almost simulates a stretch that they're doing too. The knee is going to go towards the chest, and they start to bring it across their body, which creates a little bit of pinchiness in the front. If I'm doing this with my arms, it means that my musculature is generally turned off. And what that does is it helps exclude things, reasonably speaking, like hip flexor syndrome, hip flexor, like a strained hip flexor, or even things like a sports hernia. Normally this won't hurt people with sports hernias. Sports hernias will tend to hurt a little bit more with a partial sit-up because it challenges the area, and also things like adductor stretching. Like say if I was in this position right here, it might provoke it slightly, okay? Keep in mind there are other tests that we do, and there's no one single test which will tell you what you have versus what you don't have. We cluster the information from many tests to figure out reasonably what looks like what's going on and what is being excluded. Now, a sports hernia, I'm going to use an anatomy book just to show you. I've used this on some of the other videos that I've done as well. And this one is a good starting point just to understand. So this is the abdominal area here, and they've actually sliced off the abdominal wall. The reason why I'm starting with this one is because it shows hip flexors, it shows the joint down here, the hip joint, but also shows things like some of the fascia coming from the other parts of the pelvis and into the front of the pubic bone here, okay? There's many reasons why you can have pain right into here. A sports hernia is just one, okay? Also, before we go into the next picture, I want to give you some ideas that most people generally with with sports hernias, they won't have problems just only here. A lot of times it'll move up into the abdominal wall area, into the lower abdominal region, and sometimes even into the pubic bone region here. This is a really sensitive area for people, and I'll give you a reason why in just a little bit. They'll also feel it down into the adductor. I forget, I should probably mention that. Typically, hip impingement does not refer too far down the adductor, while things like sports hernias, a lot of times they do. Now, this is a picture of the abdominal wall again, and actually into the inguinal region. This one actually shows a inguinal hernia. The reason why I wanted to pick this picture to give you guys an idea of what these things are is because this is not the same thing as a sports hernia. A sports hernia is a fraying or tearing of some of the white fascial structures into here, which doesn't create an open channel for communication of abdominal contents. Those are different things. Now, a sports hernia too, it will have to do a little bit with mechanically how the hip functions. And honestly, a lot of people find that their sports hernia is also found in combination with something like hip impingement or a CAM. The reason why this is significant is because normally what happens mechanically as the pelvis and the hip move together, typically what happens if we reverse engineer the process is if the hip doesn't work well, then areas like the pubic bone will start to create a little bit more rotation and shear. Most people will lose a little bit of hip flexion and internal rotation with their hip, and it will challenge this region here, which will create things like adductor pain, fraying or tearing of the abdominal aponeurosa, and even pain into the side of the hip as well. So long story short, many of you experiencing sports hernias will also have some type of hip impingement if you really dig deep down into the x-rays to figure out what the anatomy of the hip is. To be fair, most of the time people do not require surgery for a sports hernia, nor do they require surgery for their hip impingement. The great thing is that hip impingement, as well as sports hernias, and when they're found in combination with each other, most of the time can be resolved with rehabilitation. Normally what we're looking to solve is we need to reverse engineer the process of how the things got to how they are right now. If there's too much load or challenge happening at the pubic symphysis, at the aponeurosis, or even at the adductor or the adductor tendon, we need to reverse engineer the process to make sure that we're finding the right things that take workload away from those areas. They call them overuse injuries for a reason. Most people don't develop these things because of trauma. It's because the area is working too hard, so you must take load and workload away in order to solve your problem in the long term. We have other videos on our channel which cover things like how to improve hip internal rotation, how to improve core stabilization, and how to improve pelvic floor. A lot of these things are good starting points for people with sports hernias and hip impingement, but the sad thing is that many people need to be coached directly on how to do it because most of the times there's not a magic in the exercise, it's how the exercise is performed. The devil's in the details, if you will. If you guys are looking for help with your sports hernia or your hip impingement, we're here in Costa Mesa, California, and we have virtuals and in-person services. We've seen many people with groin pain of many different types virtually, and it has not been a problem for the most part. So we'd love to help you out. Schedule a consultation with us, and at the very least, take advantage of the webinar that we have in the corner, which covers 3 different types of hip diagnostic categories that many of you may not have heard about yet. It's 30 minutes. It's very much worth your time, and you'll learn more information in that video than you will probably on any video on YouTube. Take care, subscribe to the channel, we'll see you next time.